Hey, Econ 1A students. I wanted to go over one of the problems in the final review that a lot of people have asked about, problem 3, and those are in the final review problems. I'm going to be posting that answer key shortly, but this was the one that looked at the assets and liabilities for a bank. It asked if the bank is holding the minimum required reserves, then what is the reserve requirement, how much money can be loaned out, and how would a higher reserve requirement affect the money supply. And I think what people are getting stuck on is the starting point. So I thought I'd go ahead and walk you guys through how to do that. So we start out with this balance sheet, or this T-sheet, right? Where we can see the Bank of Sacramento's assets and liabilities. And so the liabilities are going to be the $2,500 that are deposited by individuals in the bank. And then here we've got, of that $2,500, $100 is being held in reserve. And so then the next thing we want to figure out is what is happening with the rest of the money. And the reality is the rest of that money is going to be loaned out. That's what a bank would do. In the question it says, if the bank is only holding the minimum reserve requirement, then what is the reserve ratio? So if this is what they're holding in reserves, everything else is going to be loaned out. So we can go down here to assets loans and say of that $2,500, 100 is held in reserves and 2,400 is being loaned out. Does that make sense? So all of the money they have that's been deposited, all of that $2,500 that's been deposited has to be either loans to other people or being held in reserve, right? That's what happens. The bank takes all of those dollars and divides them up into either reserves or loans. From there, we can calculate the required reserve ratio. And so what we want to do is just look at the ratio of reserves relative to total deposits. Sorry, let me move my board up here for us. And so I'll do, this is just some quick, simple math. Hopefully it'll seem a lot simpler once you see me work it out. But if we've got, the bank is holding $100 in reserve out of a total of $2,500 in deposits, then the proportion of money being held in reserve is that required reserve ratio. So 100 divided by 2,500 gives us 0.04, which means that our reserve ratio, or our reserve requirement, is 4%. If banks are holding, if this bank, the Bank of Sacramento, is holding the minimum required reserves, then that tells us that that 4% must be that reserve requirement. Does that make sense? The next part of it, the last part of it, says what would happen if the reserve requirement were higher. Well, the simple answer is if the reserve requirement were higher, less money could be loaned out because more money would be held in reserves, and that would imply that the money supply would shrink, right? There'd be less money out there for people to make loans with, and we can see how that would work. So if we take our same balance sheet, let me just fix it real quick here. So now we've got $2,500, and we're going to hold a higher percentage of reserves. So let's say we want to hold a lot more. Let's say we're going to switch it up to the reserve requirement. The reserve ratio is now going to be 10%. Well, that means that 10% of the $2,500 deposited are going to be held in reserve. So instead of $100, we're going to hold 10% of 2,500, or $250. Now we can see that that means that there's going to be fewer dollars loaned out into the market, right? Of the $2,500, $250 are going to be held in reserve, and that means that only $2,225 can be loaned out, or $2,250, sorry. So if the reserve ratio, or the reserve requirement, is 4%, $100 is loaned out, the remaining 2,400, or backtrack, do over. If the reserve requirement is 4%, that means 4% of every dollar deposited is held in reserves. So if $2,500 are deposited, 100 is held in reserve and 2,400 is loaned out. If the reserve ratio goes up to 10%, Then we're going to see 10% be held in reserves and the remaining 90%, or $2,250, be loaned out. And that's going to mean there's less cash circulating through the economy, being deposited into banks and being reloaned out. So I hope that answers that question. Let me know what other questions you have, and I will post the answer key for that for you guys